Euclid's theorem says there are infinitely many prime numbers. The divisibility transitive law says that if A divides B and B divides C, then A divides C. The divisibility linear combination law says that if A divides B and A divides C, then A divides B plus C. The divisibility linear combination law also says that if A divides B and A divides C, then A divides B minus C. The GCD linear combination theorem says the greatest common divisor of two integers can be written as an integer combination of them. The division algorithm says any integer can be written as quotient times divisor plus a remainder. The parity law says the sum of two even integers is even. The parity law says the sum of an even integer and an odd integer is odd. The parity law says the sum of two odd integers is even. The parity law says the product of an even integer and any integer is even. The parity law says the product of two odd integers is odd. The uniqueness of prime factorization says a whole number's prime factors are determined up to order. The triangle angle bisector concurrence law says the three internal angle bisectors of a triangle meet at one point. The perpendicular bisector criterion says a point is on a segment's perpendicular bisector exactly when it is equidistant from the endpoints. The parallel postulate consequence says through a point not on a line, exactly one line can be drawn parallel to the given line. The exterior angle sum rule says the exterior angles of any convex polygon add to a full turn. The uniqueness of line theorem says two distinct points determine exactly one line. The circle through 3 points theorem says three non-collinear points determine exactly one circle. The tangent secant angle theorem says an angle formed by a tangent and a chord equals an angle in the opposite arc. The radius to tangent theorem says the radius to a point of tangency is perpendicular to the tangent line. The equal tangents theorem says tangents drawn from the same external point to a circle have equal length. The right triangle altitude theorem says the altitude to the hypotenuse creates two smaller triangles similar to the original. The bisector in an isosceles triangle theorem says the bisector of the vertex angle is also a median and an altitude. The parallelogram test says if a quadrilateral has both pairs of opposite sides parallel, then it is a parallelogram. The parallelogram test says if a quadrilateral has both pairs of opposite sides equal, then it is a parallelogram. The parallelogram test says if one pair of opposite sides is both parallel and equal, then it is a parallelogram. The parallelogram test says if the diagonals of a quadrilateral bisect each other, then it is a parallelogram. The rectangle test says a parallelogram is a rectangle if one interior angle is a right angle. The rectangle test says a parallelogram is a rectangle if its diagonals are equal in length. The rhombus test says a parallelogram is a rhombus if two adjacent sides are equal. The rhombus test says a parallelogram is a rhombus if its diagonals are perpendicular. The square test says a quadrilateral is a square if it is both a rectangle and a rhombus. The central limit idea says sums of many independent small effects tend to look normally distributed. The normal curve symmetry law says a normal distribution is symmetric about its mean. The 68, 95, 99.7 rule says a normal distribution places most data within 1, 2, and 3 standard deviations of the mean. The least squares principle says the best fit line is chosen to minimize the total squared vertical errors. The vertex form idea says a quadratic function's graph has a highest or lowest point called the vertex. The axis of symmetry law says a parabola is symmetric about a vertical line through its vertex. The quadratic root count rule says a quadratic can have 2, 1, or no real solutions depending on its discriminant. The rational root test says any rational solution of a polynomial with integer coefficients must come from factors of its constant term and leading coefficient. The conjugate root theorem says complex non-real roots of a real coefficient polynomial come in conjugate pairs. The fundamental theorem of algebra says every non-constant polynomial has at least one complex root. The logarithm inverse rule says taking a log and then an exponential, or vice versa, returns the original value on the proper domain. The exponential growth rule says equal time steps multiply a quantity by the same factor when growth is proportional to its current size. The exponential decay rule says equal time steps multiply a quantity by the same factor less than 1 when decay is proportional to its current size. The geometric sequence rule says a sequence is geometric if each term is obtained by multiplying the previous term by a constant ratio. The arithmetic sequence rule says a sequence is arithmetic if the difference between consecutive terms is constant. The telescoping sum idea says many sums simplify because most intermediate terms cancel. The permutation principle says order matters when counting arrangements. The combination principle says order does not matter when counting selections. The symmetry of combinations says choosing k items from n gives the same count as choosing the n-k items to leave out. Pascal's rule says combinations from n items can be built from combinations from n-1 items in a consistent way. The binomial theorem says expanding a power of a sum produces coefficients given by combinations. The triangle inequality for absolute values says the absolute value of a sum is at most the sum of absolute values. The reverse triangle inequality says the absolute difference of two numbers is at least the difference of their absolute values. The intermediate value principle says a continuous graph that goes from below a level to above it must cross that level. The horizontal line test says a function is one-to-one exactly when every horizontal line hits its graph at most once. The inverse function theorem, school level, says a one-to-one function can be reversed to make an inverse function. The periodicity law says sine and cosine repeat their values after a fixed interval of angles. The quadrant sign rule says the signs of sine and cosine depend on which quadrant an angle lies in.